The will was missing. I stood in the dining room clutching the folder I kept in the back of my filing cabinet where I always kept it. Labeled in my handwriting, Mom and Dad, Estate. Now, it was just an empty sleeve. The overhead light flickered softly, casting long shadows over the wooden table. The scent of old cinnamon candles clung to the air, my mother's favorite. But she wasn't here. Neither was the trust I once had in this house. My brother Eric said, "You must have misplaced it, Lynn," with that smug half-shrug he always used when he lied. I didn't reply, because last week that very document was there, the one where they named me executor. Where the house, the only family asset worth anything, was to be mine. I didn't need the house. I just needed the truth to stay intact. But now Eric had power of attorney. Just for the surgeries, they said. It's temporary, they promised. And yet, 2 months later, the joint care account I opened was empty. I checked it again that morning. Balance $23.17. And a single memo from 3 weeks ago: transfer, Eric P. That ring of Mom's, the rose gold one with the ruby she wore every Christmas, gone from her drawer. And today, after I asked about the money, they sat me down like a child. "You need to let this go, Lynn," my mother said gently. "You're making things difficult," Dad added. Eric just sat there, silent, watching. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "If you can't forgive Eric, maybe it's best you don't come around anymore." I couldn't breathe. Not because I was shocked, but because deep down, I knew they'd say it. I walked out, folder still in hand. Empty like their promises. I sat in my car for a long time. The engine off. The silence louder than any scream. That's when I decided this wasn't going to be about revenge, but I would not be erased. Would you forgive the brother who took everything if your parents asked you to? Or would you finally choose yourself? Where are you listening from? Has your family ever asked you to be the bigger person at your own expense? I grew up in a house where being the oldest meant being the anchor. While Eric ran wild through the yard with scraped knees and forgotten chores, I was the one helping Mom with the grocery budget. By 12, I was folding laundry with her after church while Dad napped. By 16, I was the one who knew where the tax folders were alphabetized by year. I never resented it, not then. That's just how our family worked. In a small city like Spokane, you don't question tradition. You carry it. And I carried them. I paid their internet when the check bounced. Called the pharmacy when Dad couldn't remember which refill was which. Stayed up late rebalancing their books when they just didn't get the online account. Eric, he'd show up when there was meatloaf or a chance at cash. Mom would beam when he walked in the door like he'd come home from war. "You know your brother's trying," she'd whisper like I needed reminding. "He's just not like you." But I always let it go. Because letting go felt easier than tearing it all open. Then came 2020. The year everything slowed down. Dad's back gave out. Mom had trouble climbing stairs. And suddenly everything became a lot. "I moved back into my old room temporarily," I said. "Just until the surgeries passed. At first, I made it work. My laptop on the old oak desk I painted teal in high school. Printer plugged into the kitchen outlet because it was the only one that didn't spark. I kept track of everything. Bills, meds, calls, passwords. I set up a care account, both our names on it. I even added Eric for emergencies. They asked me to. Just in case, Mom said. God forbid something happens to you. I remember pausing then, fingers hovering over the keyboard, feeling something. But I clicked add user, like a good daughter does. 2 weeks later, Eric took out $3,000. No explanation. Just a message from the bank that read large withdrawal authorized. I asked him about it. He said it was for upgrades. Didn't say what. I asked Mom. She said he's fixing up the basement. For Dad. It's a good thing. The basement he never touched. When I asked for receipts, she looked at me like I'd slapped her. "Do you really think your brother would steal from us?" Her voice cracked like a window under pressure. That was the first time I realized something terrifying. It wasn't just Eric I was up against. It was the version of him they wanted to believe in. The golden boy. The charmer. The one who meant well. And me, I was the one keeping the lights on. But also the one asking too many questions. I began to notice small things. The photo of me at graduation moved to the back of the mantel. My name never brought up when visitors came by. Eric got applause for showing up with a grocery bag. I got silence for managing their appointments, prescriptions, and their mortgage. One night I walked into the kitchen after a long day at work. Mom was on the phone. She didn't see me. Her voice was soft. Eric's been really stepping up. I just wish Lynn would be more easygoing. I stood there in the doorway. Not angry. Not shocked. Just tired. Tired of being useful but never beloved. Tired of holding everything only to be told I was holding it wrong. That night, I opened my laptop and started organizing every paper I had. Emails. Bank records. Screenshots. Withdrawal histories. Not because I wanted to fight, but because suddenly it felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. I wasn't their daughter. I was the fallback plan. The function. And Eric. He was the story they wanted to believe. Sometimes the most painful betrayals don't sound like screaming matches. They sound like silence at dinner. Like a name not mentioned. Like a photo quietly removed from the wall. They sound like she's just not like you. And deep down you realize maybe that was the plan all along. It started with the mail. A thick envelope arrived one Monday morning addressed to Eric. No return address. Just a stamp and a barcode. I was heading out for groceries and almost didn't notice it, but it sat on the hallway table for 3 days. Unopened. Eric had stopped by Sunday night, dropped off a bag of oranges, and left like he always did, smiling vague in a rush. He hadn't asked about the account. He hadn't mentioned the basement. He never did. On the 3rd day, I picked up the envelope. It wasn't sealed tight. Inside loan statements. Refinance documents. A form with my parents' address listed under a new mortgage Eric had taken out, using the house as collateral. My hands went cold. The kitchen light above me flickered again. I read the fine print twice. Eric's signature at the bottom. A note refinancing complete. Co-owners William Parker, Nancy Parker, Eric Parker. No mention of me. Even though I was the one paying the property tax bill every January. I felt something slide in my chest. Not anger. Not panic. Something quieter. Like a curtain finally dropping. He hadn't just borrowed money. He had leveraged the only family asset left, the house they promised would one day be mine. And no one had told me. I took photos of the documents. Scanned them to my cloud folder. Labeled it truth. Start here. That night at dinner, I watched my mother scoop mashed potatoes onto Eric's plate. He dropped by just in time as always. He laughed about something the teller said at the bank. My fork paused midair. He was at the bank, I asked casually. Which bank? He looked up like I'd startled him. Wells Fargo, he said. The downtown one. I smiled, nodded. That wasn't the bank we used for the care account. He changed something. Later that night, I logged in again. The account access was denied. Incorrect password. I checked the shared drive I created for Mom and Dad's medical files. Eric had deleted several folders. Just gone. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I dug through my own records. Old emails. Account statements. I found a withdrawal made on the day Dad was in surgery. Eric had pulled $7,500. The memo line vehicle upgrade. Dad never drove again after that week. What upgrade? The next morning I tried to talk to Mom. She was folding towels in the laundry room, humming quietly. The sunlight through the narrow window hit the back of her neck. I stood in the doorway. Mom, I said. She looked up, smiling. I didn't want to shatter anything, but I couldn't hold it anymore. I think Eric's been taking money, I said softly. I found papers. Loan documents. He used the house. Her face dropped. Not in shock. but in something heavier. She turned back to the towels. "I know," she said. 3 words. And the sound of something cracking inside me. "You know," I whispered. She nodded. "He said he needed help. And you've always had things more figured out. We thought I interrupted. Dad knew." She didn't answer. I walked out. My chest burned. The betrayal wasn't just Eric anymore. It was sanctioned, allowed, justified. Later that week, I tried again with Dad. He was watching television in his recliner, feet up, glasses slipping down his nose. "Dad," I started, sitting on the armrest like I used to. He didn't look at me. "I found the loan documents. Eric used the house." Still no response. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" He finally turned. His eyes were tired but clear. "Because we knew how you'd react," he said. "You'd make it a thing. You always make things a thing, Lynn." I stood. Not because I was angry, but because I couldn't breathe. They didn't tell me. Because I cared too much. Because I would have asked for accountability. Because I'd have wanted answers. That night, I stood in the garage and stared at the box labeled Lynn, college, still taped shut from my move years ago. Never fully unpacked. There was an old sweatshirt inside. My degree. A framed picture of me holding Eric's hand at his high school graduation. Back when he used to call me Linny. I hadn't heard that name in years. The next morning, I woke up early. Made coffee. Saturday with my laptop. Started a folder called Legal Notes. I wrote down everything I knew. Dates, amounts, transactions, changes in account access. I contacted a lawyer from town, one I trusted from a tax audit years ago. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Eric. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. Because somewhere in the hollow of my chest I already knew. I had never been the daughter who was chosen. Just the one who kept everything from falling apart. But now I was choosing me, and I was going to find out what that looked like. The bank manager looked at me like I didn't belong there. Not rudely. Just curiously. I sat across from her in my best slacks and a clean blouse, the kind I saved for meetings that mattered. My hands rested on a manila folder. Inside, screenshots, printouts, bank statements, copies of the will. "I'm sorry," she said, again folding her hands gently. "But as of 3 months ago, Mr. Eric Parker is the primary on all associated accounts. The power of attorney paperwork names him as sole agent." I blinked. Not because I didn't understand, but because I suddenly realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was intentional, it was done, and it was legal. I thanked her, politely, quietly, then walked out into the sharp spring air. The wind caught the edge of my coat. I gripped the folder tighter. I didn't cry, not there. But something in my chest burned like ice. That night I went home and pulled out the original draft of my parents' will. The one they signed in 2015. The one where I was listed as executor. The one that clearly said the property would pass to me for reasons of long-term contribution and primary caregiving. I compared signatures, dates, clauses. Eric's version filed at the bank was dated 2023. A new draft. Different structure. No mention of my name. I didn't know which was worse. That they changed it. Or that they didn't tell me. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house. Our house. The one I paid property taxes on for 5 years. Mom was making tea. The scent of peppermint filled the kitchen. I placed the folder on the table. Opened it slowly. "I want to talk," I said. Calm. Measured. She looked down. Brows furrowing. "Where did you get that?" "At the bank," I said. "Where Eric filed a new version of your will, where I'm no longer mentioned." Her hand shook slightly as she set the cup down. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Yes, you do." Dad entered the room, then newspaper folded under his arm. He paused, sensing the tension. I didn't wait. I turned to him. "Did you know Eric refinanced the house?" His jaw tensed. "He told us, after the fact. He said it was to consolidate debt." "It's not his house," I snapped. "I've been paying every bill for years. I've taken care of everything, and now, I'm gone from your documents. Mom's eyes filled with tears. We didn't think it would matter to you. You're stable. You have a job. A life. Eric's different. There it is again, I said, voice flat. He's different. He needs more. I'm capable, so I'm dispensable. Dad raised his voice slightly. That's not fair. We trusted him to help. You were always intense about these things. Because someone had to be, I shouted. You think this was easy? Canceling trips, moving back and balancing my job with caregiving while he swooped in for praise and payday, I felt myself shaking. Not from rage, from grief. Because I had defended them. Because I thought they just didn't know. But they did. They chose. And it wasn't me. Mom tried to reach for my hand. I pulled away. I'm not here to beg, I said, quieter now. I just want you to hear what you've done. Dad sighed. It's just a house. I laughed. But it wasn't a laugh. It was something broken. It's not just a house, I said. It's the erasure of everything I've given. Everything I've held together while you looked the other way. Eric showed up half an hour later. Like he knew. Like he'd been waiting. He walked in with that lazy confidence he always had. Keys dangling from his finger sunglasses still on indoors. You storming the castle, he said. Grinning. I stood. Faced him. You stole from them. He raised an eyebrow. I didn't steal. I managed things. They asked me to handle stuff while you micromanaged. You deleted my access. You emptied accounts. You changed legal documents. He shrugged. Don't act like you didn't expect it. You always needed to be the hero. Guess what? The family picked someone else. There it was. The truth, naked. Ugly. Final, he wasn't even sorry. I kept every receipt, I said, my voice low now. Every transfer, every change. I have the 2015 will. I have documentation of your withdrawals during Dad's hospital stays. I have everything. He stopped smiling. You're bluffing. I shook my head. I'm not. Eric looked at Mom. Then Dad. But they said nothing, and I realized he'd never need to lie. Because they'd never ask. I turned toward the door, paused at the threshold. I'm done, I said, but not in the way you think. Then I left. That night, I emailed my lawyer every file I had, asked her to begin the process. To challenge the new will. To freeze activity on the joint account. I wasn't walking away, I was walking through. And when the storm passed, they would finally see what it looked like when the daughter they ignored stopped saving them. The silence that followed was worse than any argument. Days passed, no calls. No emails. Not even a forwarded grocery list. I thought maybe Mom would reach out. Just a short message. Even a misplaced voicemail. But there was nothing. Not after I walked out. Not after I involved a lawyer. Not after I sent a copy of the filing letter to their mailbox. I became a ghost in my own family. The first Sunday I didn't show up, no one asked why. Denise, my closest friend and former colleague, texted me that night. Did you talk to them yet? I stared at the message, unsure how to reply. What would I say? That they chose the child who took? That I was the one who stayed, but they forgot how to see me? I typed. They know what they did. I just didn't know what I meant to them until now. She sent back one line, you meant everything until you asked for something back. It hit me harder than I expected. I spent that week buried in work. Taxes for 2 nonprofit clients. Spreadsheet audits. I let my coffee go cold 3 mornings in a row. The kettle sat unused. The television stayed off, but the house had echoed louder than usual. Everywhere I looked there was a reminder. The quilt Mom made when I passed the CPA exam. The framed family photo Eric gifted me 5 Christmases ago, crooked now on the hallway wall. The key hook by the door labeled home. What even was home? One afternoon, I stopped by the grocery store. A simple errand. Bananas. Milk. Laundry detergent. And there by the refrigerated aisle stood my parents. They didn't see me at first. They were looking at the yogurt shelf, whispering back and forth. Mom was holding a flyer. Dad looked tired. I froze. Felt like I'd been dropped into someone else's memory. I almost turned around, but then she looked up. Caught my eye. Her face stiffened. She didn't wave, didn't smile. Just turned back toward the dairy section. That was it. I walked past without stopping. My heart beat faster than I wanted it to. My hands shook on the cart handle. At checkout, I dropped a can. It rolled under the stand. No one helped me pick it up. Back home, I sat in the garage. Motor off. Hands on my lap. And for the first time since all of this began, I cried. Not the soft cinematic kind, the kind where your shoulders shake and your chest tightens and no sound comes out, because I wasn't just grieving what Eric did. I was grieving the version of my parents that only existed in my memory. The ones who made sandwiches for my school field trips. The ones who danced to soft jazz in the kitchen on Saturday nights. The ones who said, "We'll always take care of each other." That promise had a silent clause. Until it became inconvenient. I thought about calling. Just once. To ask why, to beg don't erase me, but I didn't. Because I knew. Even if they picked up, they'd ask me to let it go. And I couldn't. Not this time. A few days later, Denise came over with Thai takeout. She didn't press me, just sat at the kitchen table, opened the containers, and poured wine into mismatched mugs. We ate in silence for 10 minutes. Then she said, "You're allowed to grieve them while still protecting yourself." I didn't answer. She reached over and touched my hand. "You were the bridge. And now that you've stepped off, they don't know how to meet you halfway." I bit my lip. Nodded. "Maybe they never planned to," I whispered. Denise didn't say anything. She didn't need to. That night, I opened a new journal. Wrote one line at the top of the page: "I can love them and still walk away." I stopped waiting for them to call. Something shifted in me the week after the grocery store. Not out of rage, but from clarity. I wasn't going to win them back. Not by being silent. And certainly not by being small. So I started treating the entire thing like I would a case at work. First, I documented everything. Printed every bank statement, every account change, every withdrawal Eric made since 2020. Created folders, digital and physical. Labeled by category: unauthorized transactions, original will, refinance records, medical timeline. I printed screenshots of text messages, old emails, even reminders from Mom that said things like, "You're so good at this, Lynn. Thank you for always keeping us afloat," because the truth wasn't always loud, but it was layered. And I needed every one of those layers. Next, I made appointments. Denise connected me with a family law attorney, Barbara, who didn't blink once when I told her what had happened. She wore a charcoal gray blazer, spoke in short, precise phrases, and never once softened her voice to spare my feelings. "You have a case," she said, flipping through my files. "A strong one." I almost cried. Not because of the legal win, but because someone finally saw the whole story and didn't ask me to shrink inside it. Barbara walked me through my options. We couldn't undo everything, but we could freeze some assets, challenge the recent version of the will, initiate a financial misconduct inquiry, especially since I had receipts proving funds were taken while my father was incapacitated. It wasn't about revenge. It was about holding a line. A line I never thought I'd need to draw between me and my own blood. That weekend, I cleaned the entire house, top to bottom. It wasn't about dust or clutter. It was about ownership. Reclaiming space, physical and emotional. I pulled the old quilt off the back of the closet. The one Mom made, stitched with initials from all three of us. I laid it on the guest bed. Stared at the letters. L. EMI stood there for a long time. Then folded it, placed it in a sealed bag, and put it away. Not in anger, just to protect what was mine. By Tuesday, my name was removed from the shared care account. Eric moved fast. Barbara filed a formal injunction the next day. Temporary hold. No activity until further notice. That same evening, I got a text from Mom. Short. Cold. I can't believe you'd bring lawyers into this. You're tearing us apart. No, hi. No, how are you? Just blame. I didn't respond. She texted again hours later. If you wanted to talk, we could have worked it out as a family. Could we, though? When every attempt I made ended with me being labeled too much. Too intense, too rigid, too emotional. Never enough of the right kind of daughter. I turned off my phone, lit a candle in the kitchen. Saturday with a cup of decaf and the sound of the clock ticking above the stove. There's a peace that comes after the chaos. Not the kind that makes everything better, but the kind that reminds you you're not crazy. That your reality happened, and you're allowed to name it. Barbara emailed me a list of next steps. Court dates. Asset evaluations. Copies of statements they'd subpoena. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. No texts, no doorbell. No guilt choking me awake. The next morning I opened the curtains wide, let the sun hit every inch of the floor. I played Ella Fitzgerald while I made coffee. Wore red lipstick. For no one but me. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. Not to be seen. Not to be respected. Not to exist. Eric had taken so much, but he hadn't taken my voice. And that was going to be the difference. Have you ever had to stand your ground quietly? While being told you were the problem? Drop a comment below. You never know who you'll help by sharing. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more true stories of justice, healing, and empowerment after 40. I didn't tell anyone about the court date. Not Denise. Not coworkers. Not even the receptionist at the tax firm I'd temped at during spring. It felt too sacred. Too sharp. Barbara said it would take 3 filings minimum. 1 for contesting the will. 1 for freezing the financial accounts. And 1 for requesting a formal accounting of all transactions made under Eric's power of attorney. He would be served by the end of the week. I imagined him reading those papers. Sitting on his couch in the house I helped preserve holding a beer he didn't pay for. Wondering how I suddenly became the threat. But I wasn't becoming anything. I had always been the steady one. The invisible scaffold holding the whole damn thing up. The only difference now, I had stopped apologizing for it. Barbara coached me on what to expect. They'll likely push back emotionally, she said, adjusting her glasses. You need to stay grounded. Focus on documentation, not justification. I nodded. I'd spent years justifying. Now I just needed truth. I organized my notes on a timeline. First loan withdrawal. May 2021. Refinance recorded September 2022. POA document filed January 2023. Will update February 2023. I had screenshots of the shared drive disappearing. Bank alerts I'd saved but ignored at the time. Even text messages from mom that now read differently in the light of truth. But, more than that, I had receipts of my own mortgage payments in my name. Prescriptions picked up for dad. Tax filings I handled when no one else knew the login. Barbara smiled when she saw how prepared I was. You're not just ready, she said. You're the archive. We filed motion number 1 on a Thursday morning. 2 days later, I got a group text from a cousin I hadn't heard from in years. Heard what's happening. I always thought you were the one holding it all up. Just wanted to say I see you. I stared at the message for a long time. It felt like someone cracked a window open in a sealed room. I didn't reply. Not yet, but I held it close. That weekend I did something small but meaningful. I bought a safe. A real one. Bolted to the floor of my bedroom closet. Inside I placed original 2015 will. Property tax stubs. A backup drive of everything digital. And a letter addressed to myself. This is not betrayal. This is protection. I also took down the photo collage in my hallway. The one that had birthdays and Christmases and smiling family barbecues. The one where I was always in the background handing someone else a plate. I replaced it with a single frame, a candid photo of me and Denise laughing in a diner. 2 mugs between us. No makeup, No expectations, just presence. It was the first time I had ever displayed a photo in my home where I wasn't supporting someone else's joy. Barbara warned me the response would come fast. She was right. By the next Tuesday, Mom called. Twice. Then Eric. I didn't pick up. Then a voicemail, Lynn. I don't know what you think you're doing. This is tearing the family apart. You're hurting Mom. Just stop. Let it go. I deleted it. Then a message from Dad, less angry, more exhausted. We can fix this. Don't go too far. But they never asked what Eric had done. They never asked what I needed. Just that I stop. That I shrink. Denise came over again that week. We sat on the patio with wine and spring air. She looked at me for a long time, then said, "You seem taller." I laughed. But I knew what she meant. It wasn't height, it was something in my spine. "Do you think I'm being cruel?" I asked her. She shook her head. I think you've just stopped bleeding for people who won't even give you a Band-Aid." That line stayed with me. I thought about it days later when Barbara called to say the judge approved the temporary injunction. Eric could no longer move any joint funds. The house equity was locked until review. Small steps, but powerful ones. I didn't post online, didn't make any announcements. I just showed up. Quietly, firmly. At the next hearing, I would stand in a courtroom not as the bitter daughter, but as the record keeper. The one who remembered everything while they insisted it was all no big deal. And for the first time, they would have to listen. The courtroom was smaller than I imagined. No dramatic chandeliers. No echoing marble. Just rows of creaky wooden benches, cream walls, and a ticking clock that sounded louder than it should have. I sat beside Barbara at the petitioner's table. The manila folders in front of us felt heavier than they were. Not from their weight, but from what they held. Eric sat across from me. His hair-styled shirt collar too stiff. He looked every bit the polished younger brother until you looked closer. His fingers kept tapping his knee. He didn't look in my direction once. Behind him, Mom and Dad sat 2 rows back. She clutched her purse like a lifeline. Dad wore his old Sunday suit, his shoulders smaller than I remembered. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Everyone sat. Barbara stood first. She spoke calmly, but each sentence landed like a brick. "We're here to contest a revised estate document question, financial conduct under power of attorney, and request a forensic review of family-managed assets." The judge nodded. Eric's lawyer, a man who looked like he hadn't aged a day since law school, adjusted his tie and rose. My client acted with the belief he was serving the family's best interests. Miscommunications may have occurred, but no ill intent. Barbara didn't flinch. She handed the court printed bank statements, text transcripts, digital logs. She introduced a notarized affidavit from a witness who confirmed Eric had brought paperwork alone, no parents present. Then it was my turn. My knees were stiff when I stood. But my voice was steady. I didn't look at Eric. I looked at the judge. And then just briefly at my mother. "I'm not here out of bitterness," I began. "I'm here because I did everything they asked, and when I stopped sacrificing, I was erased." My throat tightened, but I kept going. For years I handled bills, doctor visits, medications, taxes. I logged into accounts at midnight. I printed documents. I filled out forms. I was the one in the room when the hard conversations happened. I paused, took a breath, and then, in the quiet, my name disappeared from the story. From the accounts, from the legacy. The will changed. The house was refinanced. My voice was removed. But I was still here. Still holding everything they no longer wanted to carry. The room stayed silent. Not cold, not hostile, just waiting. "I'm not asking for vengeance," I said softer now. "I'm asking for recognition. That what I did mattered. That what he took was not his to take." I sat down. Barbara gently placed her hand on the table just once. Eric's lawyer spoke next, trying to reframe my words. Family tensions. Miscommunication. Gray areas. Then the judge asked Eric to explain. He hesitated, mumbled about financial stress, said I took over everything and made him feel useless. He didn't deny the withdrawals, didn't dispute the timeline. When asked about the will, he stammered. They said I should handle it. I thought Lynn wouldn't mind. She has everything together already. Barbara requested permission to play a voicemail from Eric to a mutual cousin. The judge agreed. His voice echoed through the small courtroom speakers. I had to move quick. Lynn would flip if she found out. But this way it's just done. No room left for doubt. The judge turned to my parents. Would either of you like to speak? Mom's lips parted, then closed. Dad adjusted his tie, but remained silent. They didn't defend him. They didn't defend me. They just sat. It felt like a knife with no handle. There was no winning. Only bleeding quieter. When the ruling came, it was clean. All contested financial assets are to be frozen effective immediately. The revised will shall undergo formal review. A full audit will be conducted. Barbara leaned toward me. You did it. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow. Outside, the spring air was crisp. The street buzzed with ordinary life, horns, buses, students with coffee. I stood at the curb holding my coat shut. Eric passed by without a glance. Mom followed, eyes straight ahead. Dad trailed behind, slower. None of them looked back. Barbara stood with reporters briefly. Local coverage. No drama, just facts. I walked to my car. Unlocked the door. Saturday in silence. For 20 minutes I didn't move. Didn't cry. Didn't breathe deeply. Just existed. That night I lit a candle in my living room. Denise called. I didn't answer. I pulled out the envelope. Barbara had given me court documents, summaries, stamped copies. Set them neatly in my safe. Then I poured a glass of wine and replayed a voicemail from Mom, one from 2 years ago, before everything broke. I know we don't say it enough, but we see how much you do, sweetheart. You're incredible. I saved it. Not because I forgave her, but because I needed to believe I wasn't always invisible. Later, I deleted every message after that one. The guilt-laced ones. The ones begging me to be the bigger person I had been. And now I was being something else. Someone who didn't bleed out for silence. I changed the photo on my home screen. From a family picture taken 5 Christmases ago to a photo of me and Denise at the lake. Sunglasses on. Smiling for no one. Because this story wasn't just about loss. It was about reclamation. Not loudly, not for show, but mine. All mine. As I walked away from the courthouse steps, something about the air felt different. Lighter maybe, but not soft. There was no applause, no music. Just the low hum of cars, the distant siren, the scuff of my heels against old concrete. But inside, there was a quiet shift. I remembered a morning from childhood. I was maybe 9. Eric had dropped a glass in the kitchen and ran, scared he'd get in trouble. I picked up the shard, slicing my palm. Mom scolded me not for cleaning up but for making it worse by bleeding on the floor. Back then I thought if I stayed quiet I'd be appreciated. Turns out, sometimes silence just makes you easier to erase. That memory came rushing back now. Not to hurt me, but to remind me why I'd stopped bleeding for them. When I got home that night, I didn't turn on any lights at first. I let the sun set naturally. Let the shadows stretch across the hardwood like old stories being pulled into dusk. I walked to the cabinet where I kept family papers, school photos, old letters, hand-drawn Mother's Day cards. Some of them were beautiful. Some hurt just to hold. I pulled out a manila envelope labeled Mom, POA. I stared at it for a moment, then slowly slid it into the shredder. One sheet at a time, deliberate. Calm. Each page curled and disappeared like layers of betrayal dissolving into dust. When I finished, I wiped the counter clean and lit the kitchen candle. Vanilla cedar, warm, earthy, steady. I made myself tea. Mint and chamomile. No rushing. No checking the clock. The house was mine. The space was mine. And for the first time in years, my decisions were not extensions of someone else's needs. Later that night, I stood barefoot by the window, watched the neighbors walk their dogs. Someone laughed from a porch 2 doors down. The world hadn't changed. But I had. They may never apologize. Eric may never understand. My parents may never admit the roles they played, but I stood up. I told the truth. And I had proof that it mattered. This wasn't vengeance. It was alignment. Not justice as punishment, but justice as clarity. And I would carry that forward. In every decision I made from now on. And that was enough. I didn't move far. Just 20 minutes west of the house I grew up in. But it felt like a different world. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, big windows, and hardwood floors that creaked just enough to remind me I was alive. There was no quilt on the couch. No photos of people who'd left me behind. Just me, a kettle, a shelf of well-worn books, and the soft sound of wind brushing the balcony screen. I unpacked slowly, one box at a time. Not because there was too much, but because I didn't want to rush building something that belonged entirely to me. On the second morning, I made a ritual. Coffee by the window. 10 minutes of silence, no emails, no phone, just light and breath. I started writing again too. Nothing fancy. Just pages about what I knew, being the daughter who stayed too long, the sister who was too responsible to be seen, the woman who decided she didn't want to be needed more than she was loved. Denise visited every Sunday. She brought pastries from the cafe near her office and refused to let me host like I used to. "This is your rest season," she'd say, shoving a croissant into my hand. And rest doesn't mean unfinished business. It means peace you don't have to earn. Some nights I still felt it, the tug. The urge to call. To check if Mom's blood pressure had spiked. To make sure Dad took his evening meds. To see if Eric had learned anything at all, but I didn't. Because now I knew the difference between love and responsibility. And love doesn't erase you. One day I received a letter from my father. A short handwritten note. I read the court summary. I didn't know how deep it all went. I still don't know what to say, but I hope you're okay. We're adjusting. There was no apology. But there was something in the way the word adjusting was written, heavy, slanted, like he'd rewritten it twice. Like it wasn't just about him. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer next to my passport and emergency cash. It wasn't closure. But it wasn't denial either. And that was progress. A few weeks later, I stood in line at the DMV to update my address. When the clerk asked if I wanted to change my emergency contact, I paused. For years, it had been Eric. Out of habit, not trust. I erased his name, typed in Denise's, a choice. Not an obligation. By fall, I started teaching a financial basics workshop at the local library. It wasn't flashy. 6 women, some retired, some recently divorced. All tired of feeling lost every time they opened their bank app. We didn't just talk about numbers, we talked about value. About how self-worth and spreadsheets were more connected than we'd been told. We laughed, we cried, we learned. And I realized something quietly beautiful. I wasn't just rebuilding, I was planting. Planting boundaries, routines, trust, even hope. One woman, Margaret, stayed after every session. She was 62, wore wide-brimmed hats, and had a voice like sandpaper dipped in honey. She told me, "You remind me that walking away doesn't make you selfish. Sometimes it makes you holy." That sentence stuck with me. The next day, I wrote it on a sticky note and placed it on my bathroom mirror. Beside it, I wrote something else. "You didn't walk away from them, you walked back to yourself." On Thanksgiving, I didn't cook. Didn't text anyone. I hiked a local trail. Carried a thermos of spiced cider and a notebook. I wrote, "This year I am grateful for the silence that doesn't scream at me. For mornings that don't require performance. For the girl inside me who finally heard, you've done enough." The audit on Eric's actions concluded in December. He was ordered to repay a portion of the misused funds. The will was reverted to its original version. I didn't tell anyone. Didn't gloat. Didn't write a post. I just smiled. Quietly, inwardly. And went home. My home. The one no one else had power over. That winter I came across an old photo while cleaning out a storage bin, me at 15 standing between my parents and Eric. We were at the state fair. I had braces. Eric was holding a giant stuffed bear he hadn't won. I remembered he'd begged me to play the game for him, said he didn't want to lose in front of the girl he liked. So I stepped up, aimed, and won the prize. He took credit. Smiled in the photo like it had always been his. I looked at that picture for a long time. Back then, it felt normal. Now I saw it for what it was, a pattern. I placed it back in the bin, but this time I added a sticky note. Let this stay in the past. At my final library session, Margaret brought a bouquet of tulips and a handwritten card. Inside it read, "You taught us more than money. You taught us we could start again without shame." I hugged her tight. After the workshop ended, one woman emailed me weeks later. She had opened her own account. Left a relationship that drained her. Booked her first solo vacation. She ended the message with, "Thank you for showing me that quiet doesn't mean powerless." I reread that line 3 times. Because that's what this whole story had become. Not about betrayal, but about what came next, what I chose to carry, what I left behind. Closure wasn't about being right, it was about being free. I looked around my apartment. No wedding china. No family antiques. No old bills stuffed in junk drawers. But there was peace, a lamp that cast warm light, a bookshelf that made sense only to me. A closet full of things I loved, not things I kept out of obligation. That was my legacy now. And every day I woke up in this space, I remembered I didn't lose a family. I found myself. That night, I placed a fresh journal beside my bed. On the first page, I wrote only one sentence: "You were never too much. They were just too small to hold you." Then I closed the cover, turned off the light, and slept. Not with one eye open. Not waiting for a call, just peace. Finally, peace. If you've ever had to rebuild from the silence others left behind, this story is yours too. Have you walked away from a family that refused to see you? Share your truth below. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more real stories of justice, healing, and empowerment after 40. You are not alone, and your story isn't over.